Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Bibliobibly, where we are beginning Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince.
No jazz hands?
It's too significant for such frivolity.
No playing. This is serious.
This is a serious book.
Would you say dead serious?
Oh, still too soon. It hurts. It's funny, but it hurts. Chapter 1. The Other Minister. It was nearing midnight, and the Prime Minister was sitting alone in his office, reading a long memo that was slipping through his brain without leaving the slightest trace of meaning behind. He was waiting for a call from the president of a far-distant country, and between wondering whether the wretched man would telephone, and trying to suppress unpleasant memories of what had been a very long, tiring, and difficult week, there was not much space left in his head for anything else. The more he attempted to focus on the print on the page before him, the more clearly the Prime Minister could see the gloating face of one of his political opponents. This particular opponent had appeared on the news that very day, not only to enumerate all the horrible things that had happened in the last week, as though anyone needed reminding, but also to explain why each and every one of them was the government's fault. The Prime Minister's pulse quickened at the very thought of these accusations, for they were neither fair nor true. How on earth was his government supposed to have stopped that bridge collapsing? It was outrageous for anyone to suggest that they were not spending enough on bridges. The bridge was fewer than 10 years old, and the best experts were at a loss to explain why it had snapped completely in two, sending a dozen cars into the watery depths of the river below. And how dare anyone suggest that it was a lack of policemen that had resulted in those two very nasty and well-publicized murders? Or that the government could have somehow foreseen the freak hurricane in the West Country that had caused so much damage to both people and property? And was it his fault that one of his junior ministers, Herbert Chorley, had chosen this week to act so peculiarly that he was now going to be spending a lot more time with his family? "A grim mood has gripped the country," the opponent had concluded, barely concealing his broad grin. And unfortunately, this was perfectly true. The Prime Minister felt it himself. People really did seem more miserable than usual. Even the weather was dismal. All this chilly mist in the middle of July. It wasn't right. It wasn't normal. He turned over the second page of the memo, saw how much longer it went on, and gave it up as a bad job. Stretching his arms above his head, he looked round his office mournfully. It was a handsome room, with a fine marble fireplace facing the long sash windows, firmly closed against the unseasonable chill. With a slight shiver, the Prime Minister got up and moved over to the window, looking out at the thin mist that was pressing itself against the glass. It was then, as he stood with his back to the room, that he heard a soft cough behind him. He froze, nose to nose, with his own scared-looking reflection in the dark glass. He knew that cough. He'd heard it before. He turned very slowly to face the empty room. "Hello?" he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. For a brief moment he allowed himself the impossible hope that no one would answer him. However, a voice responded at once, a crisp, decisive voice that sounded as though it were reading a prepared statement. It was coming, as the Prime Minister had known at the first cough, from the frog-like little man wearing a long silver wig who was depicted in a small, dirty oil painting in the far corner of the room. "To the Prime Minister of Muggles. Urgent we meet. Kindly respond immediately. Sincerely, Fudge." The man in the painting looked inquiringly at the Prime Minister. Said the Prime Minister. "Listen, it's not a very good time for me. I'm waiting for a phone call, you see, from the President of—" "That can be rearranged," said the portrait at once. The Prime Minister's heart sank. He'd been afraid of that. "But I really was rather hoping to speak—" "We shall arrange for the President to forget to call. He will telephone tomorrow night instead," said the little man. "Kindly respond immediately to Mr. Fudge." Oh, very well," said the Prime Minister weakly. "Yes, I'll see Fudge." He hurried back to his desk, straightening his tie as he went. He had barely resumed his seat and arranged his face into what he hoped was a relaxed and unfazed expression, when bright green flames burst into life in the empty grate beneath his marble mantelpiece. He watched, trying not to betray a flicker of alarm, as a portly man appeared within the flames, spinning as fast as a top. Seconds later he climbed out onto a rather fine antique rug, brushing ash from the leaves of his long pinstriped cloak, a lime-green bowler hat in his hand. "Ah, Prime Minister," said Cornelius Fudge, striding forward with his hand outstretched. "Good to see you again." The Prime Minister could not honestly return this compliment, so said nothing at all. He was not remotely pleased to see Fudge, whose occasional appearances, apart from being downright alarming in themselves, generally meant he was about to hear some very bad news. Furthermore, Fudge was looking distinctly careworn. He was thinner, balder, and greyer, and his face had a crumpled look. The Prime Minister had seen that kind of look in politicians before, and it never boded well. "How can I help you?" he said, shaking Fudge's hand very briefly and gesturing toward the hardest of the chairs in the front of the desk. "Difficult to know where to begin," muttered Fudge, pulling up the chair, sitting down, and placing his green bowler upon his knees. "What a week! What a week!" "Had a bad one too, have you?" asked the Prime Minister stiffly, hoping to convey by this that he had quite enough on his plate already without any extra helpings from Fudge. "Yes, of course," said Fudge, rubbing his eyes wearily and looking morosely at the Prime Minister. "I've been having the same week you have, Prime Minister. The Brookdale Bridge, the Bones and Vance murders, not to mention the ruckus in the West Country." I mean to say, some of your people were involved in those things, were they?" Fudge fixed the Prime Minister with rather a stern look. "Of course they were," he said. "Surely you've realised what's going on?" hesitated the Prime Minister. It was precisely this sort of behaviour that made him dislike Fudge's visit so much. He was, after all, the Prime Minister, and did not appreciate being made to feel like an ignorant schoolboy. But of course it had been like this from his very first meeting with Fudge on his very first evening as Prime Minister. He remembered it as though it were yesterday, and knew it would haunt him until his dying day. He'd been standing alone in this very office, savouring the triumph that was his after so many years of dreaming and scheming, when he had heard a cough behind him, just like tonight, and turned to find that ugly little portrait talking to him, announcing that the Minister of Magic was about to arrive and introduce himself. Naturally, he'd thought that the long campaign and the strain of the election had caused him to go mad. He had been utterly terrified to find a portrait talking to him, though this had been nothing to how he felt when a self-proclaimed wizard had bounded out of the fireplace and shaken his hand. He'd remained speechless throughout Fudge's kindly explanation that there were witches and wizards still living in secret all over the world, and his reassurances was that he was not to bother his head about them, as the Ministry of Magic took responsibility for the whole wizarding community and prevented the non-magical population from getting wind of them. It was, said Fudge, a difficult job that encompassed everything from regulations on responsible use of broomsticks to keeping the dragon population under control. The Prime Minister remembered clutching the desk for support at this point. Fudge then patted the shoulder of the still dumbstruck Prime Minister in a fatherly sort of way. "Not to worry," he had said. "It's odds on you'll never see me again. I'll only bother you if there's something really serious going on our end, something that's likely to affect the Muggles, the non-magical population, I should say. Otherwise, it's live and let live, and I must say you're taking it a lot better than your predecessor. He tried to throw me out the window, thought I was a hoax planned by the opposition." At this the Prime Minister had found his voice at last. You're not a hoax, then?" It had been his last desperate hope. "No," said Fudge gently. "No, I'm afraid I'm not. Look." And he turned the Prime Minister's teacup into a gerbil. "But," said the Prime Minister breathlessly, watching his teacup chewing on the corner of his next speech. "But why's no one told me?" "The Minister of Magic only reveals himself, or herself, to the Muggle Prime Minister of the day," said Fudge, poking his wand back inside his jacket. "We find it the best way to maintain secrecy." "But then," bleated the Prime Minister, "why hasn't a former Prime Minister warned me?" At this Fudge actually laughed. "My dear Prime Minister, are you ever going to tell anybody?" Still chortling, Fudge had thrown some powder into the fireplace, stepped into the emerald flames, and vanished with a whooshing sound. The Prime Minister had stood there quite motionless, and realised that he would never, as long as he lived, dare mention this encounter to a living soul, for who in the wide world would believe him? The shock had taken a little while to wear off. For a time he tried to convince himself that Fudge had indeed been a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep during his grueling election campaign. In a vain attempt to rid himself of all reminders of this uncomfortable encounter, he'd given the gerbil to his delighted niece, and instructed his private secretary to take down the portrait of the ugly little man who'd announced Fudge's arrival. To the Prime Minister's dismay, however, the portrait had proved impossible to remove. When several carpenters, a builder or two, an art historian, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer Hall had all tried unsuccessfully to prise it from the wall, the Prime Minister had abandoned the attempt and simply resolved to hope that the thing remained motionless and silent for the rest of his term in office. Occasionally he could have sworn he saw out of the corner of his eye the occupant of the painting yawning, or else scratching his nose. Even once or twice simply walking out of his frame and leaving nothing but a stretch of muddy brown canvas behind. However, he'd trained himself not to look at the picture very much, and always to tell himself firmly that his eyes were playing tricks on him when anything like this happened. Then, 3 years ago, on a night very like tonight, the Prime Minister had been alone in his office when the portrait had once again announced the imminent arrival of Fudge, who had burst out of the fireplace, sopping wet and in a state of considerable panic. Before the Prime Minister could ask why he was dripping all over the Axminster, Fudge had started ranting about a prison the Prime Minister had never heard of, a man named Sirius Black, something that sounded like Hogwarts, and a boy called Harry Potter, none of which made the remotest sense to the Prime Minister. "I've just come from Azkaban," Fudge panted, tipping a large amount of water out of the brim of his bowler right into his pocket. "Middle of the North Sea, you know. Nasty flight. The Dementors are in an uproar." He shuddered. "They've never had a breakout before. Anyway, I had to come to you, Prime Minister. Black's a known Muggle killer, and he may be planning to rejoin you-know-who. But of course you don't even know who you-know-who is." He gazed hopelessly at the Prime Minister for a moment and then said, "Well, sit down. I'd better fill you in. Have a whiskey." The Prime Minister rather resented being told to sit down in his own office, let alone offered his own whiskey, but he did nevertheless. Fudge pulled out his wand, conjured up 2 glasses full of amber liquid out of thin air, pushed one of them into the Prime Minister's hand, and drew up a chair. Fudge had talked for more than an hour. At one point he'd refused to say a certain name out loud and wrote it instead on a piece of parchment, which he had thrust into the Prime Minister's whiskey-free hand. When at last Fudge stood up to leave, the Prime Minister had stood up too. "So you think that—" He'd squinted down at the name in his left hand. "Lord Vault—" "He who must not be named!" snarled Fudge. "I'm sorry. You think that he who must not be named is still alive, then?" "Well, Dumbledore says he is," said Fudge, as he'd fastened his pinstripe cloak under his chin. "But we've never found him, and if you ask me, he's not dangerous unless he's got support, so it's Black we ought to be worrying about. You'll put out that warning, then? Excellent. Well, I hope we don't see each other again, Prime Minister. Good night." But they had seen each other again. Less than a year later, a harassed-looking Fudge had appeared out of thin air in the Cabinet Room to inform the Prime Minister that there had been a spot of bother at the Quidditch, or that was what it sounded like, World Cup, and that several Muggles had been involved, but that the Prime Minister was not to worry. The fact that you-know-who's mark had been seen again meant nothing. Fudge was sure it was an isolated incident, and the Muggle Liaison Office was dealing with all the memory modifications as they spoke. "Oh, and I almost forgot," Fudge had added. "We're importing 3 foreign dragons and a sphinx for the Tri-Wizard tournament. Quite routine, but the Department of the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures tells me that it's down in the rulebook that we have to notify you if we're bringing highly dangerous creatures into the countries." Dragons?" spluttered the Prime Minister. "Yes, 3, said Fudge, "and a sphinx. Well, good day to you." The Prime Minister had hoped beyond hope that dragons and sphinxes would be the worst of it. But no. Less than 2 years later, Fudge had erupted out of the fire yet again, this time with news that there had been a mass breakout from Azkaban. "A mass breakout?" repeated the Prime Minister hoarsely. No need to worry, shouted Fudge, already with one foot in the flames. "We'll have them rounded up in no time. Just thought you ought to know." And before the Prime Minister could shout, "Now wait just 1 minute," Fudge had vanished in a shower of green sparks. Whatever the press and the opposition might say, the Prime Minister was not a foolish man. It had not escaped his notice that, despite Fudge's assurances at their first meeting, they were now seeing rather a lot of each other, nor that Fudge was becoming more flustered with each visit. Little though he liked to think about the Minister of Magic, or as he always called Fudge in his head, the other minister, the Prime Minister could not help but fear the next time Fudge appeared it would be with graver news still. The sight, therefore, of Fudge stepping out of the fire once more, looking dishevelled and fretful, and sternly surprised that the Prime Minister did not know exactly why he were there, was about the worst thing that had happened in the course of this extremely gloomy week. "How should I know what's been going on in the, wizarding community?" snapped the Prime Minister now. "I have a country to run, and quite enough concerns at the moment without—" "We have the same concerns," Fudge interrupted. "The Brockdale Bridge didn't wear out. There wasn't really a hurricane. Those murders were not the work of muggles, and Herbert Chorley's family would be safer without him. We are currently making arrangements to have him transferred to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. The move should be effected tonight." "What do you... what?" blustered the Prime Minister. Fudge took a deep, great breath and said, "Prime Minister, I am very sorry to tell you that he's back. He who must not be named is back." "Back? When you say back, he's alive? I mean—" The Prime Minister groped in his memory for the details of that horrible conversation of 3 years previously, when Fudge had told him about the wizard who was feared above all others, the wizard who had committed 1,000 terrible crimes before his mysterious disappearance 15 years earlier. "Yes, alive," said Fudge. "That is, I don't know. Is a man alive if he can't be killed? I really don't understand it, and Dumbledore won't explain properly. But anyway, he's certainly got a body and is walking and talking and killing, so I suppose, for the purposes of our discussion, yes, he's alive." The Prime Minister did not know what to say to this, but a persistent habit of wishing to appear well-informed on any subject that came up made him cast around for any details he could remember of their previous conversations. "Is Sirius Black with, he who must not be named?" "Black? Black?" said Fudge distractedly, turning his bowler rapidly in his fingers. "Sirius Black, you mean? Merlin's beard. No, Black's dead. Turned out we were, mistaken about Black. He was innocent after all, and he wasn't in league with he who must not be named either. I mean," he added defensively, spinning the bowler hat still faster, "all the evidence pointed. We had more than 50 eyewitnesses. But anyway, as I say, he's dead. Murdered, as a matter of fact, on Ministry of Magic premises. That's going to be an inquiry, surely." To his great surprise, the Prime Minister felt a fleeting stab of pity for Fudge at this moment. It was, however, eclipsed almost immediately by a glow of smugness at the thought that, deficient though he himself might be in the area of materializing out of fireplaces, there had never been a murder in any of the government departments under his charge. Not yet, anyway. While the Prime Minister surreptitiously touched the wood of his desk, Fudge continued. "But Black's by the by now. The point is, we're at war, Prime Minister, and steps must be taken." "At war?" said the Prime Minister nervously. "Surely that's a little bit of an overstatement." "He who must not be named has now been joined by those of his followers who broke out of Azkaban in January," said Fudge, speaking more and more rapidly, and twirling his bowler hat so fast that it was a lime-green blur. "Since they've moved into the open, they've been wreaking havoc. The Brockdale Bridge, he did it, Prime Minister. He threatened a mass muggle killing unless I stood aside for him, and—" "Good grief, it's your fault those people were killed, and I'm having to answer questions about rusted rigging and corroded expansion joints, and I don't know what else," said the Prime Minister furiously. "My fault?" said Fudge, colouring up. "Are you saying you would have caved in to blackmail like that?" "Maybe not," said the Prime Minister, standing up and striding about the room. "But I would have put all my efforts into catching the blackmailer before he committed such an atrocity." "Do you really think I wasn't making every effort?" demanded Fudge heatedly. "Every Auror in the Ministry was, and is, trying to find him and round up his followers, but we happen to be talking about one of the most powerful wizards of all time, a wizard who has eluded capture for almost 3 decades. "So I suppose you're going to tell me he caused the hurricane in the West Country too?" said the Prime Minister, his temperature rising with every pace he took. It was infuriating to discover the reason for all these terrible disasters and not to be able to tell the public. Almost worse than it being the government's fault after all. "There was no hurricane," said Fudge miserably. "Excuse me?" barked the Prime Minister, now positively stamping up and down. "Trees uprooted, roofs ripped off, lampposts bent, horrible injuries—" "It was the Death Eaters," said Fudge. "He who must not be named's followers, and we suspect giant involvement." The Prime Minister stopped in his tracks as though he'd hit an invisible wall. "What involvement?" Fudge grimaced. "He used giants last time when he wanted to go for the grand effect," he said. "The Office of Misinformation's been working round the clock. We've had teams of obliviators trying to modify the memories of all the muggles who saw what really happened. We've got most of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures running around Somerset, but we can't find the giant. It's been a disaster." "You don't say!" said the Prime Minister furiously. "I won't deny that morale is pretty low at the Ministry," said Fudge. "What with all that, and then losing Amelia Bones." "Losing who?" "Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. We think he who must not be named may have murdered her in person, because she was a very gifted witch, and all the evidence was that she put up a real fight." Fudge cleared his throat, and with an effort, it seemed, stopped spinning his bowler hat. "But that murder was in the newspapers," said the Prime Minister, momentarily diverted from his anger. "Our newspapers. Amelia Bones. It just said she was a middle-aged woman who lived alone. It was a nasty killing, wasn't it? It had a rather lot of publicity. The police are baffled, you see." Fudge sighed. "Well, of course they are," he said. "Killed in a room that was locked from the inside, wasn't she? We, on the other hand, know exactly who did it. Not that that gets any further toward catching him. And then there was Emmeline Vance. Maybe you didn't hear about that one." "Oh, yes, I did," said the Prime Minister. "It happened just round the corner from here, as a matter of fact. The papers had a field day with it. Breakdown of law and order in the Prime Minister's backyard." "I'll have that wasn't enough," said Fudge, barely listening to the Prime Minister. "We've got Dementors swarming all over the place, attacking people left, right and centre." Once upon a happier time this sentence would have been unintelligible to the Prime Minister, but he was wiser now. "I thought Dementors guard the prisoners in Azkaban," he said cautiously. "They did," said Fudge wearily, "but not any more. They've deserted the prison and joined he who must not be named. I won't pretend that wasn't a blow." "But," said the Prime Minister with a sense of dawning horror, "didn't you tell me they're creatures that drain hope and happiness out of people?" "That's right. And they're breeding. That's what's causing all this mist." The Prime Minister sank weak-kneed into the nearest chair. The idea of invisible creatures swooping through the towns and countryside, spreading despair and hopelessness in his voters, made him feel quite faint. "Now see here, Fudge, you've got to do something. It's your responsibility as Minister of Magic." "My dear Prime Minister, you can't honestly think I'm still Minister of Magic after all this. I was sacked 3 days ago. The whole wizarding community has been screaming for my resignation for a fortnight. I've never known them so united in my whole term of office," said Fudge, with a brave attempt at a smile. The Prime Minister was momentarily lost for words. Despite his indignation at the position into which he'd been placed, he still rather felt for the shrunken-looking man sitting opposite him. "I'm very sorry," he said finally. "Is there anything I can do?" "It's very kind of you, Prime Minister, but there is nothing. I was sent here tonight to bring you up to date on recent events and to introduce you to my successor. I rather thought he'd be here by now, but of course he's very busy at the moment with so much going on." Fudge looked round at the portrait of the ugly little man wearing the long silver wig, who was digging in his ear with the point of a quill. Catching Fudge's eye, the portrait said, "He'll be here in a moment. He's just finishing a letter to Dumbledore." "I wish him luck," said Fudge, sounding bitter for the first time. "I've been writing to Dumbledore twice a week for the past fortnight, but he won't budge. If he'd just been prepared to persuade the boy, I might still be... Well, maybe Scrimger'll have more success." Fudge subsided into what was clearly an aggrieved silence, but it was broken almost immediately by the portrait, which suddenly spoke in its crisp official voice. "To the Prime Minister of Muggles, requesting a meeting urgent. Kindly respond immediately. Rufus Scrimgeour, Minister of Magic." "Yes, fine," said the Prime Minister distractedly, and he barely flinched as the flames in the grate turned emerald green again, rose up, and revealed a second spinning wizard in their heart, disgorging him moments later onto the antique rug. Fudge got to his feet, and after a moment's hesitation the Prime Minister did the same, watching the new arrival straighten up, dust down his long black robes, and look round. The Prime Minister's first foolish thought was that Rufus Scrimgeour looked rather like an old lion. There were streaks of grey in his mane of tawny hair and his bushy eyebrows. He had keen yellowish eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and a certain rangy, loping grace, even though he walked with a slight limp. There was an immediate impression of shrewdness and toughness. The Prime Minister thought he understood why the wizarding community preferred Scrimgeour to Fudge as a leader in these dangerous times. "How do you do?" said the Prime Minister politely, holding out his hand. Scrimgeour grasped it briefly, his eyes scanning the room, then pulled a wand out from under his robes. "Fudge told you everything?" he said, striding over to the door and tapping the keyhole with his wand. The Prime Minister heard the lock click. Yes," said the Prime Minister. "And if you don't mind, I'd rather that door remained unlocked." "I'd rather not be interrupted," said Scrimgeour shortly. "Or watched," he added, pointing his wand at the window so that the curtains swept across them. "Right, well, I'm a busy man, so let's just get down to business. First of all, we need to discuss your security." The Prime Minister drew himself up to his fullest height and replied, "I'm perfectly happy with the security I've already got, thank you." "Well, we're not," Scrimgeour cut in. "It'll be a poor lookout for the Muggles if their Prime Minister gets put under the Imperius Curse. The new secretary in your outer office—" "I'm not getting rid of Kingsley Shacklebolt if that's what you're suggesting," said the Prime Minister hotly. "He's highly efficient, gets through twice the work the rest of them—" "That's because he's a wizard," said Scrimgeour without a flick of a smile. "A highly trained Auror who's been assigned to you for your protection." "Now wait a minute," declared the Prime Minister. "You can't just put people in my office. I decide who works for me." "I thought you were very happy with Shacklebolt," said Scrimgeour coldly. "I am... That's to say, "Then there's no problem, is there?" said Scrimgeour. Well, as long as Shacklebolt's work continues to be... excellent," said the Prime Minister lamely, but Scrimgeour barely seemed to hear him. "Now about Herbert Chorley, your junior minister," he continued, "the one who's been entertaining the public by impersonating a duck." "What about him?" said the Prime Minister. "He's clearly reacted to a poorly performed Imperius Curse," said Scrimgeour. "It's addled his brains, but he could still be dangerous." "He's only quacking," said the Prime Minister weakly. "Surely a bit of rest, maybe go easy on the drink." "A team of healers from St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries are examining him as we speak. So far he has attempted to strangle 3 of them," said Scrimgeour. "I think it best we remove him from Muggle society for a while." Okay, he'll be all right, won't he?" said the Prime Minister anxiously. Scrimgeour merely shrugged, already moving back toward the fireplace. "Well, that's all I really had to say. I will keep you posted of developments, Prime Minister, or at least I shall probably be too busy to come personally, in which case I shall send Fudge here. He has consented to stay on in an advisory capacity." Fudge attempted to smile, but was unsuccessful. He merely looked as though he had a toothache. Scrimgeour was already rummaging in his pocket for the mysterious powder that turned the fire green. The Prime Minister gazed hopelessly at the pair of them for a moment. Then the words he fought to suppress all evening burst from him. "But for heaven's sake! You're wizards! You can do magic! Surely you can sort out, well, anything!" Scrimgeour turned slowly on the spot and exchanged an incredulous look with Fudge, who really did manage a smile this time, as he said unkindly, "The trouble is, the other side can do magic too, Prime Minister." And with that the 2 wizards stepped one after the other into the bright green fire and vanished.
Oh, that was great. The interactions of Muggle Prime Ministers and wizarding.
Wasn't that a great first chapter?
Yes.
That was awesome.
The Prime Minister is just there like, what?
Right? Like, what do you... What?
All my problems have been you?
This whole time?
And now you're warning me? What the heck?
And he literally can't say anything about it or do anything about it. He just has to suffer.
I know. I wonder how Kingsley feels about being a secretary to a Muggle minister.
I know. I love that too. That's his initial reaction. He's like, I'm not getting rid of him. He's really good at his job. Well, yeah, he's a wizard. Duh.
I've reconsidered.
Alright, I'll keep him. But now you kind of get an insight as to how the governments interact with each other. Like, there is a level of interaction between the wizarding world and...
Well, we got the idea that there is a level of interaction in the third book when Sirius was showing up on the Muggle news.
Yeah, and the Muggle TV and stuff, yeah.
But wouldn't you think that they would appoint, like, his secretary or assistant to be a wizard at all times to kind of consult with?
Like, they always have a plant there?
Yeah. Like, he just walks into his office after much scheming to get to the prime minister position. I like the phrasing of that, too. After much work and scheming.
I also like the phrasing of, all the damage and suffering caused to his voters.
Yeah.
I think she captures that very well.
Politics.
Yeah. Also...
And it's in Harry Potter, so we can talk about it.
Yes. Also, it's... You miss it if you're just listening to me read it, but throughout the chapter, like, when the Prime Minister says, this man's Sirius Black, Rowling writes it Serious.
Oh, like, serious.
Yeah. And then Quidditch is spelled Kwidditch. So, like, although it's all, like, spelled wrong, because he's like, that's what I heard, I think. What?
This Quidditch.
Right. And, like, the descriptions of, like, the Floo powder travel. Like, the powder, you just threw it and it turns the flames green, and it's like...
The green flame powder.
Yeah. It's just great, the little Muggle perspective of it. Because you've spent so much time immersed in it, from Harry's perspective, that to have, like, the pure Muggle interpretations it's just funny. I don't know. I love this chapter. It's great. The Dementors are breeding.
Oh, yeah, that part got me.
And Fudge is just like, yeah, they're breeding, that's why it's misty out. And the Prime Minister must just be like, ew.
I'm never going out in the early morning again.
Gross.
Think that every time you take a walk on a misty morning, it's just Dementor love magic.
Dude, the other day I was driving to work, and it was so foggy, it was like pearly white. I don't know what was going on, but it must have been intense, because that fog was thick.
Love was in the air that morning.
I guess so. Oh.
But yeah, back to my point. Like, could you imagine winning the election? Like, yes, I'm minister. Walk into your office, saying everything up, and then all of a sudden you hear a voice. Like, what was that? Huh? Anyone there? And then all of a sudden your portrait is moving and speaking to you.
Yeah, that's...
And it's not even like telling you anything. It's just, oh yes, the minister for magic will be here soon. What?
I'm sorry. What?
I'm the minister, thank you.
I think I need to lie down. I must be very exhausted. I'm hallucinating.
You would think they would appoint, like, his assistant would always be a wizard or something. I mean, they can always just obliviate Imperius.
Yeah, or at least, like, prepare him for what's about to happen.
Yeah. Or when these situations come up, he can kind of walk him through. Well, you see, in the wizarding world... Here's what happens.
Right.
Just a little tip for the Ministry of Magic. Maybe help you
Liaison
work a little bit better. And avoid the awkward situations, albeit very funny. The new minister seems alright, though.
Rufus Scrimgeour?
Yeah. There was a little bit of terror in the back of my mind, like, I swear to God if it's Percy.
Oh, God, no. Oh.
Or Umbridge or something.
Oh. No way. Not after all that. There's no way.
I didn't know how it worked. If there was voting, or if because he got kicked out, one of his underlings then takes the office.
That
kind of like if
there's
the president gets impeached or something,
There's
vice president takes over.
I've listened to a lot of discussions about how political stuff works in
England,
in Harry Potter.
Oh.
So Rowling has said that they vote for the prime minister,
yes.
or the minister for magic. He is voted in.
Mm-hmm.
But when stuff like this happens, like Fudge resigning, and the people call for someone specifically instead, that person just kind of emergency steps in.
Oh, gotcha.
And I think the government has to the other ministry people have to agree on that.
Oh, so
it's like an emergency appointment thing, but it's also
the rest of the ministry still has a say in whether they approve of said person.
I think so, because it can't be Percy Weasley, because he doesn't know, he's not gonna know what he's doing. Amelia Bones died,
which is funny because when we were watching the movie, I actually said that just the other night. That I was surprised that she didn't play a bigger part, or she wasn't mentioned more in Order of the Phoenix.
Yeah, she was just literally there in the beginning asking about the Patronus, and then Susan Bones says...
Yeah, she kind of stood out from the rest of the people, and then the next time you hear from her is about her daughter. At the DA meeting.
It's her niece.
Her niece.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm pretty sure Amelia Bones is Susan Bones is her niece.
And then that's it. And then now you hear about she's dead.
And Voldemort apparently killed her in person.
It's an honor.
Yeah, it is. Voldemort thought you were important enough to be killed by him himself.
Mm-hmm.
I think she serves the point of she's not a major character. She's kind of an ancillary character, but she's mentioned in the sense of she's not going with the status quo of denial. She's willing to listen. She's very gifted. She's tries to stand up for what's right and do the right thing. And done.
Yeah.
So I think she's just there to reiterate
Voldemort's evil.
Yes.
He's a bad guy.
Yes. And don't give an F who he has to kill to get in his way.
Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting that Fudge mentioned that he's been writing to Dumbledore, and now Rufus Scrimgeour is writing to Dumbledore, trying to convince the boy, but it hasn't worked. I'm assuming they're talking about...
Harry.
Convince Harry to do what?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't know. Also, Fudge lost his job.
That's great.
He lost his job. He deserves that.
Yes.
It was terrible. He failed on every level.
And we hear that after the end of the last book, he failed many more times.
Yes.
Over and over and over. And over again.
I just love everything. We suspect giant involvement. I'm sorry, what? What? Dragons? What?
And the Dementors. Dementors are on your side. Not anymore.
Oh. At the very, very end of the chapter, he's like, well, why don't you do something? You can do magic. I don't understand.
Which I think would be everyone's response.
And I think the answer is just equally as great. That's the problem. They can do magic too. Like,
well, and the real problem
mic drop. It was a mic drop moment.
Which is putting it lightly. I think the real issue is, and if he was honest, he would have said, yeah, but he can do magic better.
Yeah, fair.
That's the true answer to it.
Yes, but he's better at magic than we are. So, we have a problem. He's kind of like...
We're bringing a knife to a gunfight here, okay?
He's the best around. Nothing's gonna ever keep him down.
Except Harry Potter.
Also, Fudge being like, well, is he alive? I'm not sure. We can't kill him. He's walking and talking, so I'm gonna say he's alive, but Dumbledore won't explain it to me, so...
Which makes me wonder... If that's true, and they can't kill him, we know Harry can. And...
Sorry, I'm laughing so much.
And possibly Dumbledore, because he is the only one that he ever feared. Why is Voldemort being so secretive? Like, man, if I was immortal and nothing could kill me, I wouldn't have hid out or did anything like that. I'd just walk up into places. Like, yeah, whatever. You're all dead.
You'll find out in this book how the immortality thing, the can't be killed thing, works.
Okay, well, that answers my question, I guess.
That's the best thing I can say is the secret to Voldemort's I can't kill you thing in this book.
Ah, okay. Well then. What's the next chapter called?
The next chapter is called Spinner's End.
Spinner's End?
Yes.
Is this a name, Spinner? Or is it, like, you know, Spinner Top from Inception?
It is a place.
Oh, okay.
I'll give you that.
It's a place.
It's a place.
Spinner's End.
Yep.
I got nothing for that. They're gonna go to Spinner's End.
Who's gonna go to Spinner's End?
Dumbledore and Harry.
Okay. Dumbledore and Harry. Is that just because of the cover?
Yes.
Okay. One more thing about this chapter is I thought it was a really, really great way to start the book out with, kind of catches you up on what's been going on since Order of the Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of lets you know, like, really how serious things are getting. Like, bad things are happening. Muggles are being affected. People are dying, like, on a regular basis. Like, things is not good. Things have escalated. But in a funny way. Without doing the whole thing from Harry sat at number 12 Privet Drive and read the newspaper.
Number 4 Privet
Number
Drive.
4 Privet Drive.
Oh my, I already gotta start correcting you on this.
Sorry. Watching the news, and he knew that bridge collapse was no accident. Voldemort was on the move. You know.
He brushed back his unkempt hair,
revealing the lightning bolt scar that...
above his circular glasses and blazing green eyes.
That looked just like his mother's eyes, but he looked the spitting image of his father. Hedwig was out hunting, and he hoped that maybe he would get a letter from Ron and Hermione later. Dudley was also being an asshole over the summer. That also was happening. And Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon were also...
Well, I hope they weren't being assholes. And with the way the last book ended, it's not going to end good for them.
That's true.
Going to have some more Muggle casualties. And what about the Dursley family? Oh, no, that wasn't him. That was, that might have been the Aurors. You mean my assistant? He wasn't there, but
it was one of our Aurors and a werewolf. I'm sorry, a what? Oh, man. I haven't laughed this hard reading a chapter in a hot minute. This chapter is just so much fun. It's a good one. So, since I've been sacked as Minister for Magic, I have nothing else to do except close out the video. So, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tune in next time for Chapter 2, Spinner's End.